The chainsaw roared to life at 6 in the morning. I watched from my bedroom window as Sheriff Karen stood beside her patrol car, arms crossed, that smug smile plastered across her face. 3 city workers surrounded my 100-year-old oak tree with cutting equipment. My hands trembled as I dialed my lawyer, but it was too late. The first cut bit deep into ancient bark. What happened next changed everything. That magnificent tree had one final act of revenge planned. And Karen was about to learn that nature always has the last word. My name is David, and until 6 months ago, I lived in the most peaceful neighborhood you could imagine. Maple Street had always been the kind of place where children rode bicycles until sunset and neighbors borrowed sugar without locking their doors. At the center of it all stood my pride and joy. A massive oak tree that had been growing in my front yard for over a century. That tree was not just wood and leaves to me. It was history. My grandfather had carved his initials in its trunk when he bought this house in 1962. 3 generations of my family had celebrated birthdays in its shade. Every summer, the neighborhood kids would climb its sturdy branches while parents gathered beneath, sharing stories and cold drinks on hot afternoons. The oak stretched 40 feet into the sky. Its canopy was so wide that it shaded half my front yard and part of the sidewalk. In autumn, its leaves turned the most brilliant gold you have ever seen. People would drive from across town just to take pictures. I used to joke that my tree was the unofficial landmark of Maple Street. Then Karen moved in next door. At first, she seemed normal enough. Karen was in her early 50s, divorced, with short blonde hair that she kept perfectly styled. She worked for the county sheriff's department as a deputy. When she introduced herself that first week, she was friendly and polite. She even complimented my oak tree. "What a beautiful old tree," she had said, standing at our shared property line. "They just do not make them like this anymore." I agreed wholeheartedly. I told her about its history, how it had survived 3 major storms and countless seasons. She nodded and smiled, and I thought I had found a neighbor who would appreciate what made our street special. But within a month, things began to change. Karen started making small comments about the leaves that fell on her lawn. She would stand at her kitchen window in the mornings, watching me drink coffee on my porch. Her smile became forced. Her compliments turned into suggestions. "You know, David," she said one Saturday morning as I raked leaves, "these trees sure do make a lot of mess." I laughed it off. "That is what rakes are for," I replied. She did not laugh back. Other neighbors began mentioning strange encounters with Karen. She would question them about their parking habits, their trash pickup schedules, even their visitors. Mrs. Henderson, who lived 3 houses down, told me that Karen had actually measured the distance between her mailbox and the street to see if it met county regulations. "Something is not right about that woman," Mrs. Henderson whispered during one of our evening walks. "She acts like she owns the whole neighborhood." I tried to give Karen the benefit of the doubt. Moving to a new place could be stressful. Maybe she was just trying to fit in. But deep down, I was starting to feel uneasy. The way she watched my tree, the way her jaw tightened whenever the wind blew leaves onto her pristine lawn. There was something brewing beneath her polite exterior. Everything changed the day Karen got promoted to sheriff. I learned about it when she knocked on my door that Tuesday evening. She stood on my porch wearing a brand new uniform, a shiny badge gleaming on her chest. Her entire posture had transformed. Gone was the tentative neighbor who had asked polite questions about my tree. In her place stood someone who radiated authority and entitlement. "Congratulations on the promotion," I said, trying to maintain neighborly courtesy. "Thank you, David." She stepped closer, and I noticed she was no longer smiling. I wanted to discuss your tree situation with you. Tree situation. I blinked in confusion. What tree situation? Karen pointed at my oak with the confidence of someone who had practiced this speech. That tree is dropping an excessive amount of organic debris on my property. As sheriff, I have a responsibility to maintain community standards. I need you to have it trimmed back significantly. I stared at her in disbelief. This was the same tree she had called beautiful just months earlier. The same tree that had been growing peacefully for a century before either of us existed. Karen, it is autumn. Trees drop leaves. That is what they do. Her eyes narrowed. I am not talking about normal leaf drop, David. I am talking about branches, bark, and what appears to be a rodent infestation that is spreading from your tree to my property. Rodent infestation, I almost laughed. Karen, squirrels live in oak trees. They have been living in oak trees since the beginning of time. Those rodents are destroying my garden and leaving droppings on my deck. She adjusted her badge like it was a weapon. I have researched the county ordinances, David. Property owners are required to maintain their trees so they do not create a nuisance for neighbors. I felt my temper rising, but I tried to stay calm. This tree has never been a problem for anyone else. The previous owner of your house never complained once in 15 years. Well, I am not the previous owner. Karen stepped closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt distinctly threatening. I am the sheriff now, and I take property values and community standards very seriously. Over the following weeks, Karen's harassment became a daily routine. She would appear at my property line every morning, arms crossed, staring at my tree like it was a criminal. She started taking photographs of every fallen leaf, every twig, every acorn that landed on her side of the fence. Then came the citations. The first one appeared on my door on a Monday morning. Notice of property maintenance violation. It read in official county letterhead. I was being cited for failure to maintain vegetation in accordance with county standards and faced a fine of $200 if I did not comply within 30 days. I called the county office immediately. The clerk who answered sounded confused when I described the citation. "Sir, I am not showing any record of a complaint filed against your address," she said. "Let me transfer you to our code enforcement department." Code enforcement was equally puzzled. They had no record of any tree-related violations in my neighborhood. When I mentioned Sheriff Karen by name, there was a long pause. "I would recommend you speak with the sheriff directly about this matter," the officer finally said. Karen's power trip was just beginning. She started patrolling the neighborhood in her official sheriff's vehicle, stopping at houses where she perceived violations. The Johnsons got cited for having their garbage cans visible from the street one day past pickup. The Martinez family received a warning about their dog barking during unreasonable hours, which turned out to be 3 in the afternoon. But I remained her primary target. She began bringing other county employees to examine my tree. First, it was a supposed safety inspector who declared that some of the lower branches posed a potential hazard to pedestrian traffic. Then came a self-proclaimed arborist who claimed the tree showed signs of disease, though he could never specify what kind of disease or provide any evidence. "You need to understand something, David," Karen said during one particularly aggressive confrontation. "I am trying to help you avoid bigger problems down the road. If this tree falls and hurts someone, you will be liable. If it damages property, you will be liable. The smart thing to do is remove it now while you still have a choice." Remove it? I could not hide my shock. "Karen, this tree is over 100 years old. It is perfectly healthy, and it is protected under the city's historical preservation ordinance. Her face darkened. We will see about that. Karen declared war on my tree, and by extension on me. The bogus citations multiplied like weeds after rain. I would find new violations taped to my door every few days. Excessive organic debris accumulation, unauthorized wildlife harboring, visual obstruction of public walkways. Each citation carried fines ranging from $100 to $500, and each one threatened legal action if I did not comply immediately. I spent hours researching every claim she made. The excessive organic debris turned out to be the normal leaf drop that occurred on every tree-lined street in the county. The unauthorized wildlife harboring was referring to the squirrels and birds that had lived in oak trees throughout the region for thousands of years. The visual obstruction claim was particularly absurd, since the tree was set back 30 feet from the sidewalk and blocked absolutely nothing. But Karen had an answer for everything, and that answer always involved her badge and her authority. "David, I did not write these ordinances," she would say with fake sympathy whenever I confronted her. "I just enforce them. If you have a problem with county law, you need to take that up with the county commissioners." I tried exactly that. I spent an entire afternoon at the county courthouse, speaking with clerks, commissioners, and anyone else who would listen. What I discovered made my blood boil. Most of the ordinances Karen was citing were either completely fabricated or grossly misinterpreted. The few that were real applied to commercial properties or trees that posed genuine safety hazards. When I presented this information to Karen, she simply smiled and produced a new violation notice. "I think you are confused about how the law works, David," she said, tapping the badge on her chest. "I am the one with training in legal interpretation. You are just a homeowner who is refusing to comply with reasonable requests." Then she escalated to psychological warfare. Karen began timing her patrols to coincide with my daily routines. When I left for work, she would be standing in her driveway, arms crossed, watching me drive away. When I returned home, her patrol car would be parked conspicuously at the end of my driveway. She started questioning my wife about our weekend plans and asking my teenage son about his friends who visited our house. "Just keeping an eye on neighborhood activity," she would say with that same false smile. "Part of the job." The breaking point came when she brought in her so-called expert. Dr. Richard Hoffman arrived on a Thursday morning in a pickup truck loaded with tree-cutting equipment. Karen introduced him as a certified arborist and county consultant. He was a thin man in his 60s with calloused hands and an official-looking clipboard. "This tree needs to come down," he announced after a 5-minute examination that consisted mainly of tapping the trunk with a hammer. "Advanced root rot, structural instability, immediate danger to surrounding property." I watched in amazement as this supposed expert declared my magnificent, obviously healthy oak tree a death trap. Every statement he made was demonstrably false. The tree's bark was solid and disease-free. Its root system showed no signs of rot or damage. Its branches were strong and properly distributed. "I would like to get a second opinion," I said. Dr. Hoffman looked at Karen, who shook her head firmly. "County regulations do not require multiple assessments for obvious safety hazards," she said. "Dr. Hoffman's evaluation is sufficient for enforcement action." That evening, I called the State Forestry Department and requested information about Dr. Richard Hoffman's certification. After 3 phone calls and 2 emails, I learned the truth. Richard Hoffman was not a certified arborist. He was not affiliated with any professional forestry organization. His only credential was a business license for general landscaping services. When I confronted Karen with this information, her mask finally slipped completely. "Listen to me very carefully, David." Her voice was low and threatening. "I am trying to resolve this situation amicably, but if you continue to obstruct a lawful investigation and refuse to comply with safety regulations, I will have no choice but to pursue more serious enforcement measures." "What kind of enforcement measures?" She smiled coldly. "The kind that involve handcuffs." That night I could not sleep. I stood at my bedroom window, looking down at the oak tree that had stood sentinel over my family for 3 generations. In the streetlight, its ancient branches looked both majestic and vulnerable. I realized that Karen was not going to stop. She was going to find a way to destroy my tree, whether I cooperated or not. What I did not realize was how far she was willing to go to get her way. The final ultimatum came on a Friday afternoon in the form of an official county notice nailed to my front door. "Notice of immediate abatement required," the document declared in bold red letters. "Property owner has 48 hours to remove hazardous vegetation or face criminal charges for willful endangerment and obstruction of public safety measures." My hands shook as I read the notice. Criminal charges for refusing to cut down a healthy tree that had been growing peacefully for over a century. I immediately called my lawyer, Tom Bradley, who had handled my real estate transactions for years. Tom was a practical man in his 50s who specialized in property law and municipal disputes. "David, this notice is complete nonsense," he said after reviewing the documents I faxed to his office. "Half of these cited ordinances do not exist, and the other half do not apply to your situation. This woman is either completely incompetent or deliberately harassing you." "Can she actually arrest me over this?" "Technically, yes. She has the authority to make arrests for supposed violations of county ordinances, but any prosecutor with half a brain would throw these charges out immediately. The problem is that she can still put you through the process." Tom promised to file an emergency injunction to stop any enforcement action, but he warned me that it might take several days to get a hearing scheduled. In the meantime, I was supposed to trust that Karen would not follow through on her threats. I should have known better. At 6 o'clock Sunday morning, I was awakened by the sound of diesel engines in my front yard. I stumbled to the bedroom window and felt my heart drop into my stomach. 3 county trucks were parked on my lawn. A crew of 4 men was unloading chainsaws, wood chippers, and other tree-cutting equipment. And there was Karen, standing beside her patrol car like a general surveying a battlefield. I threw on clothes and ran outside, my feet barely touching the steps as I rushed to stop what was happening. "Karen, what the hell are you doing?" I shouted across the yard. She turned toward me with the most satisfied expression I had ever seen on another human being. "Good morning, David. Since you failed to comply with the abatement notice, I am executing the county's authority to remove the public safety hazard from your property." "You cannot do this. My lawyer filed an injunction." "I have received no court order stopping this enforcement action," she replied smoothly. "Until I do, county regulations require me to proceed." I pulled out my phone and called Tom Bradley's emergency number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried the county courthouse, but it was Sunday morning and no one was available. Meanwhile, the crew chief was starting up the first chainsaw. "Stop!" I ran toward the tree, placing myself between the cutting equipment and the trunk. "This tree is protected under City Ordinance 247B. You are violating historical preservation laws." Karen stepped closer, her hand resting on her service weapon. "David, You are interfering with a lawful enforcement action. If you do not step away from the work area, I will be forced to place you under arrest." I looked around desperately. A few neighbors had emerged from their houses, awakened by the noise. Mrs. Henderson stood on her porch in her bathrobe, her phone pressed to her ear. The Martinez family watched from their driveway, their children hiding behind their parents. But no one was going to step forward and help me. No one was going to challenge Sheriff Karen's authority. I was completely alone. "Last warning, David," Karen said, pulling out her handcuffs. "Step away from the tree." I had two choices: submit to this injustice and watch my family's heritage get destroyed, or get arrested and watch it happen from a jail cell. Either way, that beautiful oak tree was about to die. The chainsaw roared to life, and the first cut bit deep into century-old bark. What happened next will be burned into my memory for the rest of my life. The crew chief, a burly man named Eddie who had been cutting trees for the county for over 15 years, made his first cut about 4 feet up from the base of the trunk. It was supposed to be a directional notch that would guide the trees fall toward the empty lot behind my house. But Eddie had made a crucial miscalculation. For over a century, this oak had grown with a subtle but significant lean toward the east. Decades of prevailing westerly winds had shaped its growth, creating an imbalance that was invisible to the casual observer but critical to anyone planning to cut it down. A professional arborist would have recognized this immediately and adjusted the cutting pattern accordingly. But Dr. Richard Hoffman, Karen's fake expert, had never mentioned the tree's natural lean in his rushed assessment. And Eddie, following standard procedure for a straight tree, cut his notch facing the wrong direction. I watched in growing horror as the massive oak began to creak and sway. But instead of falling toward the empty lot as planned, it was tilting inexorably toward Karen's house. "Something is wrong," I shouted, pointing at the tree's movement. Eddie looked up from his chainsaw and his face went pale. "Oh shit," he muttered, then louder, "Everyone get back, it is going the wrong way." The crew scattered like startled rabbits. Eddie dropped his chainsaw and ran toward the street. The other workers threw down their equipment and sprinted after him. But Karen, who had been standing smugly beside her patrol car parked in her driveway, was caught completely off guard. "What do you mean, wrong way?" she demanded, still not understanding the magnitude of what was happening. The ancient oak, weighing several tons and standing 40 feet tall, gathered momentum as gravity took control. Its enormous canopy blocked out the morning sun as it fell like a wooden avalanche toward Karen's pristine 2-story colonial home. Time seemed to slow down as I watched nature's perfect revenge unfold before my eyes. The tree's massive trunk crashed through Karen's roof with the sound of a building collapsing. Her beautiful bay windows exploded in a shower of glass and splinters. The impact shook the ground beneath my feet and echoed through the neighborhood like thunder. But the destruction was not finished. As the oak settled into its final resting place, its sprawling branches reached across Karen's entire front yard. Her luxury patrol car, a pristine black SUV that she had always kept spotlessly clean, disappeared completely under a mountain of timber and leaves. Her carefully manicured lawn vanished beneath tons of wood and debris. The sudden silence that followed was deafening. Karen stood frozen in her driveway, her mouth hanging open in shock and disbelief. She looked like someone who had just watched their entire world collapse in slow motion. Her perfect house, her perfect car, her perfect yard, all of it buried under the tree she had been so determined to destroy. "My house," she whispered, her voice barely audible, then louder, "my house." She ran toward the wreckage, stepping over branches and climbing through debris to reach her front door. But there was no front door anymore. The entire front half of her home had been crushed under the oak's massive trunk. I stood in my own yard, watching this unfold, and I felt a complicated mix of emotions washing over me. Part of me was horrified by the destruction. No one deserved to have their home destroyed, not even someone who had made my life miserable for months. But another part of me, a part I was not particularly proud of, felt a deep sense of satisfaction. This was karma in its purest form. The tree that Karen had been so determined to cut down illegally had taken its revenge in the most poetic way possible. Eddie approached me cautiously, his face grave with the realization of what had just happened. "I am so sorry, man," he said quietly. "I should have seen the lean. Any experienced cutter should have seen that lean." "It is not your fault," I replied, and I meant it. "You were following orders from someone who had no business giving them." Karen emerged from the wreckage of her home, covered in sawdust and plaster, her perfect hair disheveled and her uniform torn. She looked around wildly, as if searching for someone to blame for this disaster. Her eyes landed on me, and I saw pure fury burning in them. "This is your fault," she screamed, pointing an accusatory finger in my direction. "You did this somehow. You sabotaged the cutting." I stared back at her calmly. "Karen, your own crew cut down my tree with your fake expert's approval. I had nothing to do with which direction it fell." But I could see in her eyes that logic was not going to matter. She was going to find a way to blame me for this, just like she had found a way to blame me for everything else. Within 2 hours, my quiet street looked like the scene of a natural disaster. Fire trucks arrived first, followed by paramedics, then county supervisors, and finally a parade of insurance adjusters with clipboards and cameras. The massive oak tree sprawled across Karen's property like a wooden dinosaur, its branches reaching into her neighbor's yard and its root ball creating a crater in my front lawn. Karen paced back and forth in front of the wreckage, alternating between furious phone calls and desperate attempts to salvage belongings from the accessible parts of her house. Her patrol car was completely invisible beneath tons of timber. Even if it was somehow undamaged, it would take a crane to uncover it. The first insurance investigator, a middle-aged woman named Janet Morrison, approached me while Karen was distracted. "Sir, I understand this is your tree that fell on the neighbor's property," she said, pulling out a digital camera. "Can you walk me through what happened this morning?" I had been dreading this conversation, but I was determined to tell the truth completely and honestly. "Sheriff Karen ordered a county crew to cut down my tree without my permission," I began. "I have been fighting bogus citations and harassment for months. My lawyer filed an injunction to stop this, but she proceeded anyway." Janet's eyebrows rose. "She ordered county workers to cut down a tree on your property without your consent." "That is correct. She claimed it was a safety hazard, but the tree was perfectly healthy. She brought in someone she called a certified arborist, but I discovered he was not actually certified at all." Janet made notes while I spoke. Then she asked the question I had been expecting. "Do you have any documentation of these harassment incidents and the fake expert evaluation?" I smiled and pulled out a thick folder I had prepared weeks earlier. "I have every citation she issued, photographs of the tree showing its healthy condition, correspondence with real arborists who contradicted her expert's assessment, and recordings of several of her threatening conversations." Recordings. After she threatened to arrest me, I started recording our interactions with my phone. Wisconsin is a one-party consent state, so the recordings are completely legal. Janet's expression grew more interested as she flipped through my documentation. Mr. Thompson, this is very thorough record keeping. Have you shared any of this with other investigators? Before I could answer, Karen noticed our conversation and stormed over. What are you telling her? She demanded, inserting herself between Janet and me. I hope you are not trying to blame me for your tree falling on my house. Janet remained professionally calm. Ma'am, I am just gathering information about the circumstances that led to the tree removal. Are you the homeowner? I am Sheriff Karen Walsh, and this man has been obstructing county safety enforcement for months. He refused to remove a dangerous tree despite multiple legal notices, and now look what happened. Sheriff Walsh, I understand you ordered the tree to be cut down. Do you have documentation showing that the tree posed an immediate safety threat that justified emergency removal? Karen's confident expression flickered. Of course I have documentation. I follow proper procedures for all enforcement actions. Could I see that documentation, please? It is. It is all in my patrol car. Karen gestured helplessly toward the wreckage where her vehicle lay buried. I have copies of all her citations and notices, I offered, handing Janet another folder. I also have the county's written response stating that most of these ordinances either do not exist or do not apply to residential properties. Over the next hour, more neighbors emerged to speak with investigators. Mrs. Henderson provided a detailed account of Karen's harassment campaign throughout the neighborhood. The Martinez family showed Janet photographs they had taken of Karen measuring their property and questioning their children. Most damaging of all was Eddie, the crew chief who had cut the tree. When Janet asked him about the directional cutting plan, he admitted that no professional assessment had been conducted. We were just told to cut it down and drop it toward the back lot, he said. Nobody mentioned the lien, and I did not take time to evaluate it properly. That was my mistake, but we were under pressure to get it done quickly. Who put you under that pressure? Eddie glanced nervously at Karen, who was standing close enough to hear every word. The sheriff said it was an emergency removal that had to be completed immediately. Janet made more notes, then approached Karen directly. Sheriff Walsh, I need to ask you some specific questions about the tree removal authorization and safety assessment procedures. I do not have time for this right now, Karen snapped. My house is destroyed, my car is buried, and I need to deal with my own insurance company. Ma'am, your insurance company is going to ask the same questions I am asking. If the tree removal was conducted improperly or without proper authorization, it could affect your coverage significantly. For the first time since the tree fell, Karen looked genuinely worried rather than just angry. What do you mean, affect my coverage? Janet closed her notepad and looked directly at Karen. If your insurance company determines that you initiated an illegal action that directly caused the damage to your property, they may deny your claim entirely. The legal machinery ground into motion with methodical precision, and every gear seemed to turn against Karen. The first blow came just 3 days after the tree fell. Karen's insurance company, Mutual Assurance Corp., sent her a formal letter denying her claim for the house damage. I know this because Tom Bradley, my lawyer, received a copy as part of the discovery process for our lawsuit. The insurance company's investigation had been swift and thorough. They interviewed Eddie and his crew, reviewed all of Karen's citations and notices, and consulted with actual certified arborists about the tree's condition. Their conclusion was devastating for Karen. The insured's deliberate initiation of unauthorized tree removal on neighboring property, conducted without proper assessment or safety protocols, directly caused the damage claimed, the letter stated. This action constitutes willful negligence that voids coverage under Sections 12.3 and 18.7 of the policy agreement. In plain English, Karen had caused her own disaster, and her insurance company was not going to pay for it. The county's response was equally damaging. Faced with potential liability lawsuits from both Karen and me, county supervisors launched their own internal investigation into the incident. What they discovered made national news. Karen had been issuing fabricated citations for months, not just to me, but to dozens of property owners throughout her jurisdiction. She had been creating fake ordinances, misinterpreting real ones, and using county equipment and personnel for personal vendettas. The emergency tree removal was just the most dramatic example of her abuse of power. County Attorney Michael Barnes called a press conference to address the situation. "We have discovered systematic misconduct by Sheriff Walsh that represents a serious violation of public trust," he announced to a room full of reporters. Effective immediately, Sheriff Walsh has been suspended without pay pending criminal investigation. That same afternoon, Tom Bradley filed our lawsuit in county court. The complaint ran 37 pages and included charges of harassment, abuse of power, property damage, emotional distress, and violation of civil rights. We were seeking damages of $400,000, plus attorney fees and punitive measures. "This case represents everything wrong with unchecked authority," Tom told the local newspaper. "When law enforcement officials use their badges to settle personal disputes, it undermines the entire justice system." Karen hired her own attorney, a slick criminal defense lawyer named Robert Chase, who specialized in defending corrupt politicians. At our first hearing, Chase tried to portray Karen as a dedicated public servant who had made an honest mistake while trying to protect public safety. Sheriff Walsh was responding to legitimate complaints about a potentially dangerous tree, he argued. The fact that the removal went wrong does not make her liable for what was clearly an accident. Tom was ready for that argument. He presented the court with a 3-inch stack of evidence showing Karen's pattern of harassment, the fabricated citations, the fake expert evaluation, and the recordings of her threats. "Your Honor, this was not an accident," Tom said calmly. "This was the inevitable result of a systematic campaign of harassment and abuse of power. The defendant used her position as sheriff to wage a personal war against my client, and the damage to her own property was the direct consequence of her illegal actions." The judge, an elderly man named Harold Fitzpatrick who had been on the bench for over 20 years, listened to both sides with obvious displeasure. "I have reviewed the evidence presented by both parties," he said finally. "I find the pattern of behavior described in the plaintiff's complaint to be deeply troubling. The defendant's use of official authority to pursue what appears to be a personal dispute represents a serious abuse of public trust." Judge Fitzpatrick ordered Karen to pay for temporary housing for her own family, while also posting a bond to cover potential damages in our lawsuit. He also issued a restraining order prohibiting her from any contact with me or my family. But the legal consequences were just beginning. The state attorney general's office launched their own investigation into Karen's conduct. They discovered that she had been falsifying official reports, misusing county resources, and potentially violating federal civil rights laws with her harassment campaign. Criminal charges followed within weeks. Karen was indicted on 12 counts including official misconduct, fraud, harassment, and deprivation of rights under color of law. The federal charges alone carried a potential sentence of 10 years in prison. Local media coverage was relentless. Every day brought new revelations about Karen's abuse of power. Other victims came forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation. The county was forced to review hundreds of citations and arrests she had made, raising questions about the validity of her entire tenure as sheriff. Karen's fall from grace was swift and complete. The woman who had terrorized our neighborhood with her badge and authority was now facing the very legal system she had corrupted. Her perfect house remained a pile of debris. Her career was over. Her reputation was destroyed. And the best part was still to come. The final act of this drama played out in Judge Fitzpatrick's courtroom on a bright Tuesday morning in March, exactly 6 months after my oak tree had crashed through Karen's roof. Karen sat at the defendant's table looking nothing like the confident sheriff who had once terrorized our neighborhood. Her perfect hair was unkempt, her clothes were wrinkled, and her face showed the strain of months of legal battles and financial ruin. Her lawyer, Robert Chase, had abandoned his aggressive defense strategy and was now focused purely on damage control. Tom Bradley stood to address the court with the calm confidence of someone who held all the winning cards. Your Honor, the evidence in this case demonstrates a clear pattern of abuse of power, harassment, and deliberate misconduct by the defendant, he began. My client endured months of illegal harassment, bogus citations, and threats of arrest, all because a corrupt law enforcement official decided to wage a personal war against a tree that had been growing peacefully for over a century. The settlement negotiations had been ongoing for weeks. Karen's criminal trial was scheduled to begin in 2 months, and her lawyer knew that a civil court victory for us would strengthen the prosecution's case dramatically. He wanted to resolve our lawsuit quickly and quietly. But there was nothing quiet about the resolution we had negotiated. Judge Fitzpatrick reviewed the settlement agreement aloud for the court record. The defendant agrees to pay the plaintiff the sum of $275,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, he read. The defendant further agrees to cover all attorney fees and court costs associated with this litigation. The defendant acknowledges full responsibility for the harassment campaign and property damage described in the complaint. Karen's face crumpled as the judge continued reading. $275,000 was more than she could possibly afford, especially with her criminal defense costs mounting, and no income from her terminated sheriff position. But the financial penalty was not the most satisfying part of our victory. The defendant is permanently enjoined from any contact with the plaintiff or members of his family, Judge Fitzpatrick continued. The defendant is further prohibited from residing within a 2-mile radius of the plaintiff's address and is barred from seeking any law enforcement position within this county. In other words, Karen was banished from our neighborhood and banned from ever wielding a badge again. The criminal trial that followed was swift and decisive. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the certainty of a harsh sentence if convicted, Karen accepted a plea bargain. She was sentenced to 18 months in county jail, followed by 3 years of probation and 200 hours of community service. More importantly, she was required to make a public apology that was broadcast on local television and published in the county newspaper. I abused my position as sheriff to pursue personal grievances against innocent citizens, she read from a prepared statement, her voice barely above a whisper. I fabricated citations, misused county resources, and violated the civil rights of people I was sworn to protect. I take full responsibility for my actions and the damage they caused. Watching that broadcast from my living room, I felt the last of my anger finally drain away. Justice had been served as completely as I could have hoped. But the most meaningful victory was still to come. 6 months later, the entire neighborhood gathered in my front yard for a very special ceremony. The massive crater left by my oak tree's root ball had been filled with rich soil,